I promise this personal anecdote about losing a loved one is Halo related. So my paternal grandmother passed away sometime in about 2017. It was tragic for sure, but by that Thanksgiving, my dad's father had remarried, this time to a woman named Judy. The first time she came over, she called my dad, quote, her baby boy, and he, and in fact almost everybody else in the room, was so repulsed that it single-handedly sank our opinion of her right then and there. She tried to be too chummy to try fitting into the family like she had always been there, and that sort of sentiment, when you're dealing with someone who's effectively a stranger, comes across as really, really gross, especially because she was trying to be someone new and different, but at the same time, overly familiar. You can't have it both ways. Halo 4. So, Bungie was gone. They had moved on from Halo and were working with Activision on some new projects, and Microsoft had found a new heir to handle Halo, Microsoft. Specifically 343 Industries. They were an internal team at Microsoft whose goal was to oversee the franchise. Bungie was a bit regretful when it came to the expanded universe of the series. They felt that it answered too many questions they hoped players would fill for themselves, and it demystified a lot of the world surrounding the games too much. And that's partially why Halo Reach doesn't follow the plot of Fall of Reach, the first Halo novel, like at all. The timeline is entirely different. But now Halo was in the hands of people who had everything to gain from the expanded universe, and with the aid of former content monkey Frank O'Connor, that's his official title, as the new franchise director, he had big shoes to fill to ensure that Halo was in good hands. Halo 4 is an Xbox 360 title released on November 6th, 2012, and you can immediately tell this ain't a Bungie game. This takes place 4 years after the events of Halo 3, 4 years into a truce with the former Covenant, who have effectively disbanded. But they're back! The Chief has to get off the Forward unto Dawn fast, and to do that he's been given the ability to sprint for the first time in the series' history, now totally separate from other returning abilities like active camo. Sprinting was in Reach, but this is the first time Chief has sprinted, and it's kinda neat. I mean, I haven't really felt like sprinting was what the Chief needed. I'm of the opinion that they could have just made his regular run speed a little faster and then forego a sprint button. But the option for faster movement is at least nice. Cortana and the Chief wind up in a new distant planet called Requiem, and Cortana has a problem. See, AI like her are only supposed to last 7 years, tops, but she's been going for 8. This is an issue, as AI develop a neural net of everything they know. Over time, that net becomes more and more complex, which creates a number of errors, in turn leading to the AI making more and more rash decisions as pathways fail. It becomes harder and harder to suppress the issues this causes, and eventually the AI effectively thinks itself into insanity and burns itself out, going on a rampage in the process. This unfortunate play at dementia and schizophrenia is called rampancy, and as Cortana has been in service for 8 years, her ability to help the Chief find a way off Requiem is impaired. She believes that if she can get back to Dr. Halsey, she could rewrite Cortana's neural network with the aid of Halsey completing a new brain scan, and thus graft our Cortana's memories into a new AI copy, effectively giving her 7 more years of active service. But as she and Master Chief are stuck on an uncharted planet without any way home, there's no way the UNSC could possibly... Oh hey, the UNSC. Halo 4 isn't written like past Halos, and it sure doesn't look like past Halos either. Rather than the vibrant space opera look, Halo 4's aesthetic is meant to be more mature, taking heavier inspiration from the expanded universe than any of the past games. I would be fine with this, but some of the changes just feel arbitrary. The new battle rifle design is, at least to me, not as cool as the older one, and the grunts have a completely different voice in this game. The Chief's deep green armor is now quite desaturated too. When they say olive drab, they mean drab. All of this makes Halo 4 feel more like a reboot, a totally new take on the series, than the intended effect of feeling like a natural continuation of Halo 3. I'm not going to sit here and propose we call it Hellwalker or anything like that, but I think we can agree that this isn't like past Halo games. At all. Even when it's trying really hard to invoke the feelings of past Halos. The writing places a much heavier emphasis on the expanded universe, and it's about specific characters and their ties to one another rather than any ongoing war. The Covenant and the new bad guys, the Prometheans, are mostly just here to keep you entertained between bouts of the Chief and Cortana working through her condition. See, they wanted Master Chief to be a blank slate character. His reactions should parallel yours as you play the game, but they also wanted him to grow as a character and evaluate his role in life, which I can't do like him. I'm not a Spartan 2, I'm just a video essayist. The writing in this regard feels conflicted, like 343 is simultaneously trying to push Halo forward, but doesn't want to give up on what made the series iconic. The end result is an inconsistent feeling game, where sometimes Master Chief won't keep quiet during action scenes, and sometimes he's a man of very few words during major story beats. I want to take a moment to express some positives. The combat sandbox you've come to expect from Halo is pretty much intact. While the Chief now has a sprint button as well as an auxiliary ability not unlike Reach's shields or jetpacks, the actual combat remains more or less how you've come to expect it. There's a few new weapons, namely a decent handful of UNSC stuff, the Storm Rifle as opposed to the Plasma Rifle, and a whole new class of Forerunner weapons. The Suppressor, the Bolt Shot, the Scatter Shot, the Light Rifle, and a Pulse Grenade. The new guns are alright. The UNSC's Saw is a light machine gun that packs a lot of punch, and I am a very big fan. The Scatter Shot and Light Rifle feel a lot punchier than their counterparts, the Shotgun and Beam Rifle respectively, though I don't think they're actually more powerful. And while the new Pulse Grenade took some time to understand, the ability to completely shut down a choke point and then jetpack across a chasm while enemies get disintegrated is quite satisfying. Really, as odd of an issue as it sounds, my biggest gripe with Halo 4's arsenal is that it's maybe too expansive. While previous games had fewer weapons, the fact that I constantly switched between them as ammo ran low meant that I got a really hefty amount of experience using the game's guns, and I knew which pieces I liked and disliked. Here, you keep finding new stuff around every corner, and the end result is that sometimes you just have to improvise with whatever you can scrounge up, and quite a few times it's a weapon I have little to no experience with, and I'm probably not even using correctly. And because the weapon pool is so diluted, you don't get a lot of time with the game's arsenal over the course of its relatively short runtime. I guess you'd use this all more in multiplayer, which, let's see how much interest I have in that. Who would have thought? Additionally, the game is visually stunning, especially for a 7th gen title. Truthfully, just playing the game at a higher resolution and 60 FPS, it feels contemporary. The lighting, the lip syncing, the character animation and motion capture, it's all phenomenal. Maybe that says more about the world we live in now, where technology is kind of stagnated to the point where all these games are all just kind of part of an unflinching modern day as opposed to bespoke separate generations marked by massive leaps in technological progress, where annual additions could be jumps forward instead of finding new ways to bevel the Picatinny rails on a shotgun and blast a whole affair through Substance Painter. Halo 4 is an unquestioned peak of the 7th generation in terms of visual flair and can still hang with the very best today if you can get over the different art style it has versus other Halos. It has a lot of style, but as for substance, Halo 4 has one major issue, and it's that the whole game is kind of a 5-plot pile-up on the freeway. Master Chief and Cortana need to get off Requiem. Cortana's rampancy is making her have fits where she recklessly wields power over others. The Forerunners have teamed up with the Covenant. There's a Covenant uprising, once again after 4 years of peace. The UNSC is after an artifact by the name of the Composer, and Master Chief accidentally awakes a Promethean tyrant by the name of the Didact, who wants to convert the human race into Prometheans in a means to escape the Flood, who is otherwise entirely absent in this game. The campaign's about 5 hours long. The plots cycle in and out maybe 2 at a time, and as a result it often feels like some plots just take a backseat. While helping the UNSC fight back against the Didact, Cortana is relatively normal, maybe getting a couple of wacky voice filters to remind you that she's losing herself. Trying to contact Halsey isn't brought up again between the second and final levels, with Cortana kind of just willing to let herself run rampant while occasionally reminding the Chief she's not feeling well during the middle third of the game while being plugged into everything. The Didact spends a significant amount of time as an unseen, unfought threat, making an appearance in the third mission before returning to his orb and yelling at the player from it for almost the entire game. And the Didact himself? Yeah, he has a ton of backstory. And it's only in supplementary materials and terminals in the 343 produced Halo Combat Evolved Anniversary Edition. For reference, the Gravemind first appears in Halo 2, later appears in Halo 3, and is defeated. You see his whole reign from start to finish in-game. The high profits of Covenant, second verse same as the first, explored fully in Halos 2 and 3 as well. Didact appears a third of the way into Halo 4 and is, we'll assume, dispatched at the end, which makes his appearance feel ham-fisted. If I don't read a trilogy of novels and a sea of nearly a dozen when this game came out, I don't get what's so important about the character, which feels kinda cheap. I see him doing bad stuff, no doubt. I watch him turn Dr. Tilson into a fucking skeleton. But to know who this character is and why he is the way he is, I've gotta read. This should come as no surprise, as 343 was the part that was all in on the expanded universe. While Bungie authorized many of the novels and supplementary materials, their top priority was the games. 343, made up of Microsoft team members who had overseen dozens of Halo projects by now, wanted to be the next Star Wars or Star Trek and be the first to not have Star in the name, so their Halo titles pull egregiously from what likely could have been a satisfactory round trip through the Pizza Hut Book It program. I feel it worth mentioning that 343 found incorporating such a dense narrative difficult and unappealing for new players, but pushed for the story regardless, as director Josh Holmes had watched his mother's dementia progress over the course of the game's development, and felt that the story of Cortana's rampancy was a necessary means to add weight and gravitas to the story, as well as tackle his personal life. And honestly, I get it. For what it's worth, when it works, it works. Cortana's dealing with an intense mental illness, and she gets no sympathy from the UNSC for it. Rather than try helping combat her condition, or even better, just letting her rest until they can contact Halsey, they angrily yell at Cortana, threaten to have her decommissioned, and even attempt to arrest Master Chief for his continuing battle against the Didact. And the Chief continues to use Cortana heavily in his battle against the Didact as well. More than ever, you're plugging her into all kinds of machinery, even as it's obvious that she's struggling to maintain composure. To some respect, this is my least favorite aspect of the game, as it feels like we're completely downplaying Cortana's mental illness. Rampancy is based heavily on Alzheimer's and schizophrenia after all, actual ailments that real people are suffering with every single day. Some of them were very likely playing Halo 4 when it was new, and this kind of talk wasn't common online, and they saw one of gaming's more prominent second-in-commands throwing tantrums, calling the superior she worked with when she was new a bitch, and just unable to wield any kind of control over her emotions while her memory became more and more faulty. And not only did they not see to her condition and try to help her, she gets vilified for it, and the only two people who actually went to help her are Chief, and he keeps plugging her into stuff and making her do a lot of heavy work, and whoever this soldier is. I mentally called him Barney. I feel like nowadays, this kind of story would need some reworking to make the player feel more sympathetic towards Cortana and make the anger directed at the UNSC about the fact they refused to help her, as in its current state, neither party winds up being all that likable. I also feel it worth mentioning that rampancy was considered as a name for the condition because they didn't want to keep calling Cortana insane, and her insanity in this case is a need to prove she's more powerful or capable than those around her, barring the Chief, who she has a nearly possessive fixation on the entire time. They literally turned one of the more engaging AI characters in fiction into a jealous bitch and called her insane.
You did it!
Amazing! Wow. Fuck you! And honestly, it bothers me that Cortana's rampancy is just a product of her being old. Like, okay, so in Halo 3, Cortana gets devastated by the Gravemind. The scene, it's meant to be implied that it's like rape, and I don't like that. But the entire time, Cortana is corrupt, vulnerable, muttering nonsense. This should have been the catalyst for her degradation. When Chief wakes up at the start of the game, Cortana could have gone, "The Gravemind, I think he did something to me all those years ago. I don't feel too good. We need to get back to Halsey." And that's it. Rampancy is barely, if ever, mentioned in the past games. It might be in the books, I don't know. And as a result, it's just weird that it's brought up in-game when it is, with no real warning, the way it is, especially when you already had a major story beat to kick off this new arc. You don't need to change anything about rampancy or its unfortunate implications. Just make the Gravemind's influence on Cortana why she started deteriorating. It doesn't solve its other problems, but it at least connects his story better to 3 and obfuscates some of the implicit ageism present in the story. It feels a little late to talk about this game's levels given everything else that's been on the docket, but here we are. I'll be honest, the only noteworthy levels were those that included UNSC hardware. In the level Infinity, players get access to... hold on, we gotta stand by for Titanfall. There we go. Players get access to the Mantis, a very lousy design for a machine. Legs are very easy to destroy, and at this scale it'd be beyond cumbersome to pilot, which just begs the question as to why... The Mantis is slow but very powerful, kind of an homage to the ED-209 from RoboCop, which was satire and over-militarizing the police, but, we can play it straight, why not? Following this is a level in which the player gets to ride atop the Mammoth, effectively a human-aligned UNSC Scarab, a preposterously large truck. The wheels alone are way bigger than a Warthog, which begs into question how often they get to send this thing out. The following level has the player pilot a Pelican for the first time, not to be confused with the Falcon you pilot in the Halo Reach level, New Alexandria. The penultimate level brings the Mantis back again, and the last level in the game lets you pilot a broadsword, not unlike the sabers from the previous game, which is neat. But that's all I really remember, is the hardware. And the Didact's stupid death, monologuing to the Chief and giving Cortana enough time to... She pins him to the floor, Chief sticks a grenade to him, he falls into a portal, yeah, he's coming back for Halo 5, and then Cortana says goodbye as too much of her is stuck behind in the Didact ship, and she used the last of her energy to protect the Chief from a nuke. In her final moments of lucidity, she protected the one person she cared about most. He sulks for a while, and the game draws to a close with a monologue from the Didact. The levels are fine, but they're not particularly memorable. The machinery we get to commandeer is way more interesting than the story itself as told through its mechanical verbs. That's not meant to be a damning statement on the game. But also, Level 1 is getting off the Forward onto Dawn, Levels 2 and 3 are all about trying to signal the Infinity, and oops, Didact, stop the Didact, oops, stop the Didact, oops, stop the Didact, oops, stop the Didact, oopsie fucking whoopsie. Halo 4's actual story is just much too cramped for the amount of activities you do. The Covenant's pretty much only here to justify why you can use Covenant weaponry. Their attachment to this plot is kind of just hand-waved by being a faction that didn't know the Covenant War ended. Lousy. The Prometheans use guns not unlike the Covenants or the UNSCs, and some of them are just not as good as their counterparts from past games. Here's looking at you, Bolt Shot. Here's looking at you, Suppressor. The villain isn't well set up in this game and requires 2 info dumps to be thoroughly explained to fans unfamiliar with the novels. Fighting some of these enemies just straight up sucks. The final stage is swarming with the bastards. The game is lacking in the Y2K techno music I love, and it opts for a nearly completely orchestral sound, which paired with the muted color palette makes it feel like I'm playing a game of the movie of the game, and for the love of God, the screen won't stop shaking. I'm fine. I got this. Breathe. Let's look at this from as level ahead as we can. Halo 4 is the first game from 343 Industries, whose design is clearly distinctly different from that of Halo games in the past. The player is expected to be familiar with the world of Halo in a manner that requires extensive outside research, which isn't particularly exciting as a significant amount of Cortana's rampancy is discussed in the anime Halo Legends, and the Didact's backstory is contained in the novels. The new hardware and refreshes on series staple firearms establish a distinctly different Halo than the one we've seen before, with a thematic emphasis placed on the emotional toil of war, not just on taking down God's own anti-son-of-a-bitch machine. A lot of this feels like a means to expand the future sandbox, as if you're more focused on the story of Cortana's rampancy or Chief contemplating his life as a Spartan 2, then you probably won't blow a gasket when they introduce new threats or characters or potentially overpowered weapons, or replace series staples. And by the time you finish the campaign, all the new stuff feels second nature, and then you bring it into the multiplayer. At the end of the day, both 343 and Bungie's Halos are about shooting aliens until the game tells you you're done. But Bungie wanted to tell a story, a complete one at the beginning and end, and with some small moments here and there to pad out the world. They didn't want to explore every last detail, leave no stone unturned, because as a fan, You find those spaces and you fill them with the things you like. You got to be a Spartan, instrumental in ensuring that the fall of Reach would be the start to Halo. You also have other similar gaps in the world where you can add your own flavor, and it helps people feel like they got to be a part of that world at large. They get to help shape the future in some way, as Reach proved that Bungie wasn't particularly keen on sticking to the expanded universe as the word of gospel. It was supplementary material. It was never meant to replace the games. 343 is solely devoted to keeping the money train that is Halo moving, and as such, these nooks and crannies where fanfiction are born are a means to add to the lore and world, a space to add a supplementary novel or comic or animated series or television special that can be sold for a profit. The Halo world, with 343 at the helm, is wholly and completely a means of generating capital and keeping the Xbox relevant. Halo 4 once again brings back the multiplayer and Forge modes that have become the heart of the genre and franchise in the 7th generation respectively, but in place of the co-op wave shooter firefight is a series of Spartan Ops missions. There are 10 of them. They have their own plot set half a year after Halo 4, and it's actually not that important because the missions are short, the plot inconsequential, and the game mode rather derided by critics in 2012 given that they were hoping for more firefight. And what they got was something with significantly less replayability and less game. Allsies there. On the topic of Halo 4's critical reception, the game was met with generally positive praise, with the visual design and the chemistry between Chief and Cortana praised extensively. But the convoluted plot hinged on expanded universe stories, the seemingly forgotten plot threads, like getting back to Halsey, and the general use of screen shake and lens flare to make up for a relative lack of spectacle and scale in the campaign, was derided. Most critics weren't harsh on the game at the time, but time has not been kind to this game in retrospect. I feel like a lot of that is because of what Halo 4 ultimately represents. The pallbearers of the Bungie franchise and shepherds to its expanded world, meant to make a run-fast, shooty gun video game appealing to general sci-fi fans, have now become its creators, and they have taken several major steps from what people loved about the classic series. The Halo theme is entirely absent, the weapons, UI, and enemies are redesigned radically, old threats are ham-fistedly packed into the game alongside new enemies, and the story is much more personal with the blank slate protagonist the Chief had been up to this point, seemingly replaced with a much more introspective character. It was a big change. Intentionally so. 343 isn't Bungie. They were in charge of the novels, the companion applications, and they now had custody to the single largest property in Microsoft's repertoire. Completely. They were a studio designed to keep making Halo until the sun explodes, and they'd keep up with just that. Halo Installation 3, the Gamma Halo, was one of the locales in Halo 4, but you don't get to explore it on its own, rather investigating the crumbled planet around the installation itself. That and the Didact falling into a portal were clearly just set up for a successor game. This is just the beginning of Didact's story, as Halo 5 would... What? What do you mean the Didact story is wrapped up in the fucking Halo comic books? Then what the heck could Halo 5 be about? Oh my god. Okay, yeah, so, buckle up. We've got a long journey ahead of us. If you liked this video and you'd like to see more, I'd recommend subscribing. Coffee and social media links are in the description.